Edward III was undeniably a remarkable monarch whose reign had far-reaching consequences on England's history. He initiated the 100 Years' War, securing victories on the battlefield that defined his era. Furthermore, he sought to reform the feudal system, restoring the title of Duke to royal family members. Ensuring it was passed down to all 5 of his sons, Edward centralized power around himself, consolidating control. However, upon his death, the system he built began to fall apart. The Wars of the Roses, often thought to have started in 1455, actually trace their origins to the death of Edward III in 1377. Edward's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, was initially set to inherit the throne. However, tragedy struck before the prince could succeed his father. His untimely death left the crown to his grandson, Richard II, who was only 10 years old at the time. Richard's reign began with a council of regents, led by Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt, who had previous experience managing the kingdom during his father's illness. John had inherited Lancaster through marriage, making him the first Duke of Lancaster. His son, John, became the Earl of Somerset, and together they played a pivotal role in the forthcoming conflict. Richard II proved to be an ineffective king, swayed by those around him, granting titles without caution. Revolts began to stir, including the Peasants' Revolt and the Lords Appellants' Uprising. One of the most significant figures in these uprisings was Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, who had been exiled by Richard after a series of betrayals. Richard, distracted by a campaign in Ireland, failed to prevent Henry's return, which ignited a rebellion that ultimately resulted in Richard's overthrow. With the throne in dispute, the Lancaster and York dynasties became central players in the years to come. Richard II's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who had returned to England after being exiled, seized the opportunity to claim his birthright. Henry managed to secure the throne, establishing the Lancastrian dynasty and becoming Henry IV. His reign, however, was fraught with challenges and rebellions, as his legitimacy was questioned by many, including members of the noble class who saw him as a common usurper. Henry IV began his reign by imprisoning Richard II, whose deposition had been orchestrated through Bolingbroke's rebellion. Richard, the former king, was later believed to have died in captivity under mysterious circumstances, reportedly starving to death, though some accounts suggest he was murdered. This added to the perception that Henry IV was a ruler who had seized power through force and betrayal rather than through rightful succession. Despite securing the throne, Henry IV's hold on power remained fragile. His first year as king saw a conspiracy among the nobility to kill him during a tournament, an effort that would have restored Richard II to the throne. The plot was foiled, in part due to the intervention of Edward of Norwich, who, despite initially being part of the conspiracy, revealed the names of the traitors. This event marked the beginning of a long and tumultuous reign for Henry IV, who would continue to face challenges from within the kingdom and abroad. One of the most significant challenges to Henry's rule came from Wales. The Welsh Revolt, led by Owen Glendower, was a significant thorn in the side of the Lancastrian crown. The Welsh uprising began around 1400 and was characterized by guerrilla tactics and sporadic battles that raged on for over 15 years. It was only after the death of Henry IV and the ascension of his son, Henry V, that the revolt was finally suppressed. Henry V, unlike his father, would go on to establish himself as one of England's most renowned kings. But his successes on the battlefield came with a heavy cost to the stability of England. His military campaigns in France, particularly his victory at Agincourt in 1415, assured his place in history as a conqueror and a hero. However, these victories did little to quell the rising tensions between the York and Lancaster families, which simmered beneath the surface. In the wake of Henry V's death, his infant son, Henry VI, inherited the throne. The boy king's accession to the throne marked the beginning of an era of political instability. Henry VI's reign was characterized by his incapacity to govern effectively, compounded by mental illness and an inability to maintain control over his court. His lack of decisiveness and his reliance on ineffective advisors created an environment ripe for rebellion and infighting. As Henry VI's mental health deteriorated, the nobility began to position themselves for greater power. Richard, Duke of York, was one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom and saw himself as the rightful heir to the throne. Fists, having inherited vast estates through both Richard's paternal and maternal lines, began to challenge Henry's authority. Richard, a successful military leader in France, sought to claim the throne, particularly as Henry VI's health worsened, making him an ineffective monarch. But it was not just Richard who sought power. Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's French wife, played a pivotal role in the political landscape of the time. As a strong-willed and ambitious queen, Margaret sought to consolidate her power and ensure that her son, Edward of Westminster, would one day inherit the throne. Her reliance on ineffective military leaders and her often disastrous decisions, however, contributed to the decline of Lancastrian power. In 1450, after a series of military defeats in France, the Lancastrian forces were significantly weakened. Margaret's leadership was increasingly questioned by many, and she was accused of being more loyal to France than to England, especially after French support for the Welsh rebels under Glendower. The Lancastrian faction continued to struggle in the face of growing discontent, while the Yorkists, led by Richard of York, saw their influence grow. Richard's popularity among the soldiers and his growing political power made him the obvious alternative to the weak king. In 1453, Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown, and Richard was appointed as Lord Protector. This, however, did not quell the rivalry between the two factions, and the stage was set for open conflict. As tensions escalated, the political landscape of England became increasingly divided, with each faction, York and Lancaster, languishing their supporters. Richard of York, now in a position of significant power, continued to position himself as the rightful ruler. His supporters, known as the Yorkists, were able to build a coalition of both commoners and nobles who were disillusioned with the Lancastrian regime. The conflict between the two factions, York and Lancaster, was about to explode into open warfare. With the future of England hanging in the balance, by 1453, Richard, Duke of York, had become one of the most powerful and influential figures in England. He had inherited vast estates through both his paternal and maternal lines, making him one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. Richard's rise to prominence had been partly due to his military successes in France, where he had earned a reputation as a capable and popular commander. However, his ambitions extended far beyond the military sphere. He sought the throne itself. With Henry VI's mental state deteriorating, Richard was appointed as Lord Protector, a position that allowed him to govern on behalf of the king. But this moment of power was short-lived. The Lancastrian faction, led by Queen Margaret of Anjou, quickly began to counter Richard's influence. Richard, whose popularity was largely based on his military leadership and his appeal to the common people, faced growing opposition from Margaret and her supporters, who feared that he would eventually usurp the throne from the fragile king. Margaret, as queen consort, had powerful connections and a deep desire to ensure her son, Edward of Westminster, would inherit the throne. She viewed Richard, Duke of York, as a direct threat to her son's future, which further deepened the divide between the two factions. While Henry VI was still king, his lack of effective leadership and his fragile mental health allowed Margaret to wield considerable influence, especially in military and political matters. The tension between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians came to a head in 1455 with the Battle of St. Albans. This battle marked the first significant military confrontation of the Wars of the Roses and was a turning point for the Yorkist cause. Richard, aided by his allies, including the influential Neville family, was able to defeat the Lancastrian forces, capturing King Henry VI and effectively taking control of the government. However, despite their victory, the Yorkists' hold on power was fragile. The conflict, which had begun as a battle for political power, now began to resemble an all-out civil war. The once proud Lancastrian dynasty was not willing to accept the defeat so easily. Despite the Yorkists' triumph at St. Albans, Queen Margaret and her supporters regrouped, determined to fight on. Richard's position as Lord Protector was further undermined by his political opponents, and his reign would remain precarious. In 1459, the power struggle between the Yorkists and Lancastrians escalated further when a series of battles and uprisings forced Richard, Duke of York, and his sons to flee to Ireland. Margaret and her supporters, while still reeling from their losses, were emboldened by the Yorkists' temporary retreat. During this time, the Lancastrian faction took advantage of Richard's absence, further consolidating their control over the crown. By 1460, Richard, Duke of York, returned to England, determined to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. He gathered his supporters, including the powerful Neville family, and set out on a march to London. The Lancastrians, led by Queen Margaret, were equally determined to stop Richard from taking power. The country was now divided between the two factions, with their armies clashing in numerous battles across England. This civil war would not only affect the political structure of the kingdom, but also shape the lives of countless common people caught in the middle of the conflict. In December of 1460, the Battle of Wakefield became a tragic turning point in the Yorkist cause. Richard, Duke of York, despite his earlier victories, was defeated by the Lancastrians and killed in the battle. His death was a devastating blow to the Yorkist faction, as Richard had been the face of their cause and the man who had declared himself the rightful heir to the throne. With Richard's death, his son Edward became the new leader of the Yorkist forces. Though Richard's death seemed like a decisive victory for the Lancastrians, the Yorkists refused to surrender. Edward, now the Duke of York, immediately took command of his father's supporters and began to push back against the Lancastrian forces. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would forever alter the course of the Wars of the Roses. Edward of York quickly emerged as a promising and charismatic leader. His military talents and his ability to inspire loyalty among his followers played a crucial role in his rise to power. By 1461, Edward and his Yorkist army had decisively defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the conflict. Edward IV was crowned King of England, effectively ending the first phase of the Wars of the Roses. However, the Lancastrians were not finished, and their supporters, particularly Queen Margaret, continued to fight for control of the crown. Edward IV's victory at the Battle of Towton in 1461, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the Wars of the Roses, established him as the undisputed King of England. The defeat of the Lancastrians, led by Henry VI and Queen Margaret, seemed to mark the end of their power. Edward IV's rise to the throne, however, was not a smooth ascent. His reign would be marred by internal strife, political conspiracies, and ongoing resistance from the Lancastrian faction, which refused to give up the fight for the throne. Following his victory, Edward IV set about consolidating his power. He imprisoned King Henry VI and effectively neutralized any remaining Lancastrian challenges. However, this peace was short-lived. In the following years, the Yorkist monarchy continued to face serious opposition. One of the most significant threats to Edward's rule came from the powerful Earl of Warwick, who had been one of his greatest allies during the early stages of the conflict. Warwick, once known as the Kingmaker, grew increasingly disillusioned with Edward IV after the king secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, commoner, without consulting Warwick, who had hoped to marry his daughters into the royal family. This break in their alliance led Warwick to rebel, seeking to replace Edward IV with Edward's cousin, Henry VI's son, Edward of Westminster. Warwick, who had once helped Edward seize the throne, now allied himself with the Lancastrians in a desperate bid to restore their power. In 1470, Warwick, joined by Queen Margaret and the remnants of the Lancastrian forces, succeeded in briefly dethroning Edward IV. Henry VI was released from captivity and temporarily restored to the throne. However, Warwick's power was short-lived. Edward IV, with the help of Burgundy and his loyal supporters, managed to regroup and defeat Warwick's forces at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. Warwick was killed in the battle, and Henry VI was once again imprisoned. Edward IV's return to the throne solidified Yorkist rule for the time being, but the battle for the crown was far from over. Edward's second reign was marked by a series of uprisings, internal challenges, and the continuing influence of his powerful nobles. Edward IV himself was a complex ruler, though he enjoyed a reputation for military brilliance. His rule was also characterized by moments of indecision, self-interest, and favoritism towards certain factions within his court. One of the key events of Edward IV's second reign was his efforts to secure a lasting peace through his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a union that symbolized the consolidation of Yorkist power. Through his marriage, Edward gained the support of a number of important families, including the powerful Woodville family, which brought with it substantial wealth and influence. Elizabeth Woodville's two sons, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were now the heirs to the throne, yet their positions would become a source of immense political turmoil. After Edward IV's sudden death in 1483, Edward IV's death was unexpected. He died in April 1483, leaving behind a vulnerable monarchy. His son, Edward V, was only 12 years old and was not yet crowned. Richard of Gloucester, Edward IV's brother, was appointed as Lord Protector for the young king. Richard, later to become Richard III, quickly seized power for himself, declaring that the marriage of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid and that their children were illegitimate. This move was deeply controversial, as it paved the way for Richard to claim the throne. Whoa. Despite the fact that Edward V was the rightful heir, Richard III's usurpation was met with widespread opposition, particularly from the Woodville family, who saw their power and influence undermined by his actions. Richard's claim to the throne was controversial, and many believed that he had killed his young nephews. Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, in the Tower of London, in order to secure his own position. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of the greatest mysteries in English history, and their disappearance has only added to the suspicion surrounding Richard III's reign. A distant relative of the Lancasters seized the opportunity to challenge Richard for the crown. Henry had the support of several key factions, including the powerful Stanley family and the French, who provided him with resources and troops. In 1485, Henry Tudor landed in England with an army and marched towards Richard's forces, who were positioned at Bosworth Field. At the Battle of Bosworth, Richard III's forces, though numerically superior, were decisively defeated. Richard was killed in battle, and Henry Tudor was proclaimed king. Richard III's death marked the end of the Wars of the Roses and the rise of the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII, the new king, married Elizabeth Woodville, uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster and ushering in a period of relative peace and stability for England. The defeat of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 marked the final act in the Wars of the Roses and brought an end to the bloody conflict between the Yorks and Lancasters. With Richard's death on the battlefield, the crown passed to Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII. Henry's victory was not just a military triumph, symbolized the fall of the old feudal order and the rise of a new dynasty, one that would shape the future of England for centuries to come. Henry VII's ascension to the throne was met with a mixture of celebration and suspicion. While he was a distant relative of the Lancastrian line, many questioned the legitimacy of his claim to the crown. His father, Edmund Tudor, had been a half-brother to Henry V, but his lineage was not without controversy. To solidify his claim, Henry VII sought to unite the warring factions of England. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of Edward IV, was a strategic political move that symbolized the union of the two rival houses York and Lancaster. This union created the Tudor rose, a symbol that combined the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster, signifying the end of the feud and the beginning of a new era. Despite his efforts to reconcile the two factions, Henry's reign was not without its challenges. He faced ongoing opposition from the remnants of the Yorkist supporters who still believed that Edward IV's children, particularly the young Edward V, were the rightful heirs to the throne. Henry's first years on the throne were marked by rebellions and conspiracies, particularly from those who supported the claims of Richard III's nephews. In 1487, Henry faced a serious challenge from a pretender named Lambert Simnel, who claimed to be Edward IV's eldest son, the Earl of Warwick. Simnel's rebellion, backed by a group of disgruntled Yorkists, was defeated at the Battle of Stoke Field. This victory solidified Henry VII's rule. But it also highlighted the continuing unrest in the kingdom. Despite these challenges, Henry VII managed to strengthen his reign through strategic alliances and a series of political reforms. He worked tirelessly to secure the finances of the crown, raising money through careful taxation and avoiding costly wars. He also took steps to weaken the power of the nobles, ensuring that the monarchy retained control over the English government. Henry's cautious approach to governance allowed him to establish a relatively stable reign, laying the groundwork for the future success of the Tudor dynasty. The conclusion of the Wars of the Roses in 1485 marked a decisive turning point in English history. The conflict, which had spanned over 3 decades, had severely weakened the power of the feudal nobility, reshaping the political landscape of England. The old system of governance, based on the power and influence of the great noble families, gave way to a more centralized monarchy. This shift in power would have lasting effects on English society, politics, and governance. The Wars of the Roses also ushered in a new era in terms of military tactics and technology. The use of mercenaries, longbows, and cannons became more prevalent, changing the nature of warfare in England. The once privileged knights and feudal lords found their power diminished, as new military technologies gave the monarchy a stronger hold over the country. As a result, the political and social structure of medieval England was forever altered, leading to the rise of the Tudor dynasty. For the common people, the end of the Wars of the Roses brought both relief and new challenges. The constant violence and instability of the conflict had led to economic hardship, widespread suffering, and a breakdown in law and order. The Tudor monarchy, under Henry VII, sought to restore peace and stability. But the social and economic scars of the war were slow to heal. The legacy of the Wars of the Roses also extended to the English monarchy itself. The conflict, which had begun as a struggle between two noble houses, ultimately led to the establishment of the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, was succeeded by his son, Henry VIII, whose reign would go on to reshape English society and religion in ways that the Wars of the Roses had never imagined. The marriage of Henry VIII to Catherine of Aragon, and his subsequent break with the Catholic Church in the 1530s would spark the English Reformation, further cementing the Tudor dynasty's control over England. As for the Yorkists and Lancastrians, many of the great families of the past were weakened, and some simply disappeared from the annals of history. However, the memory of their struggle lived on in the symbols they left behind. The red and white roses of Lancaster and York, symbols of the long and bloody war that reshaped England's future. Ultimately, the Wars of the Roses left behind a nation forever changed. The power of the monarchy was strengthened, the old feudal system was dismantled, and the Tudor dynasty, though born of bloodshed and violence, would go on to define the history of England for generations to come. The age of knights and castles faded, giving way to a more modern and centralized state, where the monarchy would play a central role in the governance of England for centuries.